Let's get started. Okay, it's been at least a few weeks since we met together. We had President's Day in the middle, so we're going to just take a moment and kind of remind ourselves of the kind of, not the subject, since the subject has not changed that much, but context perhaps. So let's just remember, what is the mitzvah in which we have spent the last number of, let's say, months discussing?
Do not delay.
You shall not delay. And so what does that actually mean?
That you have three.
Yeah, go for it. Go for it.
You're going. Three holidays.
Okay, so there is some sort of time frame around you shall not delay. What is it, the thing that we're delaying?
Vow. Our vow, our promise, our pledge.
So we made a vow.
Fulfilling the vow that you've made by reading the pledge that you say you would.
Got it. Right, so I have a vow that I have made, and I have a time frame somewhere around 3 festivals. Maybe it's 12 months, maybe it's 365 days, whatever. The whole discussion comes from that.
383 days.
Or 383 days, right? We have some sort of time frame in which we have, and then if I do not fulfill my vow at that point, then what? I'm in trouble. Then I have transgressed, you shall not delay. Right? It's at that point that I've transgressed, you shall not delay, right? So I have the vow, some sort of time period, depending on who you ask, and then you shall not delay, and then we haven't really talked about what happens afterwards. Well, we're still not going to. But yeah.
Did you delay?
No, I don't know if that's true or not.
There
is some penalty or some recurring penalty, depending on, so whatever. So one of the questions we're about to encounter is who this restriction, for lack of a better way of putting it, you shall not delay, this mitzvah is incumbent upon. That's what we're going to talk about today. Who falls into this category? Okay, so we're on page 272. We are about halfway through 6b in Rosh Hashanah. Moed Katan is the other Gemara we're learning. That's a different conversation. So we're going to start off by just reviewing the language itself. So we're on the second paragraph where it starts with Ba'e Rabbi Zera. Does everybody see that? Okay. So right in the second line, you will see 1, 2, 3, 4. The fifth word says the word Rahmana. Does everybody see that? The word Rahmana here sounds like what word? Rachaman or Rachamim. Right? It means the compassionate one. And what that means is we're going to get a quote from God. God is the compassionate one.
I mean, two interesting facts about it. Right? One is, for Muslims, one of the ways they typically refer to God is the all-merciful, right? So I think there's a historical connection there, whether they took it from us or whether that was part of the ethos of the time.
And also Allah comes from Elohim.
Well,
right.
Yeah, certainly in Arabic.
Right. So it's valuable for us to know this is a fairly common way of referring to the divine here. So we know when it's
one other linguistic thing to bring up, because there's the word rachamim comes from Hebrew recha, which is wound, right? So there's the sense that on the one hand, stereotypically, compassion would be a female attribute, but we get the male and female contrast. Like in the Torah service when it's Av Harachamim, Father, merciful Father, it's that male-female contrast. So I think it's an interesting linguistic use.
Cool. I hadn't really thought of that. That's interesting. So here, when we see the word Amar Rahmana, we know that we're getting a quote from the Merciful One, which means we are getting a quote from Torah, or some sort of reference to Torah. If you look on the third word on the third line, it says Dilma. That is the word perhaps, or maybe, which means we know we're going to get some sort of biblical quote, and then we're going to get some sort of, maybe, or something like that. Is everybody with me so far? And we do this just so that we can sort of break down all the different things that we might encounter so we can get a framework for it set up early. All right, can I get a volunteer to read for me in English? Rabbi Zera asks. Go for it, Rich.
It's my job. Okay.
I like it.
Rabbi Zera asks, in the case of an heir, what is the halakha with regard to the prohibition of you shall not delay?
Great. Let's pause there for a sec. In the case, this is a classic way the Gemara is going to ask a question. It's going to say, in the case of a blank, what is the halacha? Right? They ask it all the time. There are different frameworks, but here you can see in the Aramaic, 1, 2, 3, 4, fifth word, it says mahu, and often is like the word ma. It's gonna ask the same kind of question, right? What is the halacha of it? So before we read into it, what do we think the halacha is, based on everything we know? What might we think? Yeah, Cindy?
So I think what we kind of sort of touched on last week is that if it is a particular animal that was obligated and that animal still exists, then the heir should donate it. He's responsible. But if it was a more general promise, then maybe not.
So if the vow, which could specify a specific animal, can be fulfilled because the animal still exists, then perhaps the heir might have an obligation. And if not, and it was more general, like an animal, perhaps the heir won't have that obligation.
It wasn't clear.
Right, not clear. What do you think?
No.
Oh, no.
I'm
Anyone
good.
else?
I'm good.
Want to venture a guess? Put yourself in the mind of the rabbis here.
Oh, is it only a male heir?
It's a good question. Do you think that matters?
Sure, it matters.
Orthodox or Reformed?
Matters to us, it matters to them, yeah. Sure.
Right, so the Hebrew word is yoresh, which is masculine, but we understand that the context of this was men writing for men, so it was probably other men that they were considering.
Okay.
But we know certainly from in the Torah itself, the daughters of Tzelovchad, inheritance is not so simple, thank God. So one question is, who counts? Who is this heir we're talking about, right? Maybe a nephew counts, right? Or right? Could be. It doesn't have to be a child. I'm not offering that as the answer. I'm saying something to think about.
Is it given that the son would know that his father had made such a vow?
So I don't know that that's a given, but that's a really good point.
What if the son's only a year or two old?
Right. Yeah. So how old, right, does this child, such that they may or may not know, or I don't know everything my father is doing. I can't say that I know every promise he makes, right? So maybe there's a lack of knowledge, or knowledge is relevant here.
Well, and that's a really interesting question, like even in the modern day. So when my mother died, my father, distributed her estate to children as he was supposed to. But he also gave us a note, and the note essentially said, I expect that when, and there were some restrictions on it because he couldn't actually collect it right away, but he essentially said, I expect that when this is finally distributed to you, you will make a thus and such donation. Right? It's about Alzheimer's, right? And so he wanted us to donate to a particular organization a certain amount of money out of that inheritance, which was really kind of an interesting lockup. Now that I'm thinking about it.
Right.
It's really kind of an interesting thing. So
That wasn't his your mother's thing, that was his thing.
yes. Yeah, well, so my mother actually couldn't make the decision for herself at that moment in time, certainly. She had Alzheimer's, had for many years. So
So I think obligations around inheritance are certainly complicated, right? There's another one, which is kivud ava'im, honoring one's parents, may or may not be a factor here. I may not be obligated, but I honor my parents' obligations, and so I do it.
Right.
I'm not saying that that's the answer here. I'm saying there are lots of factors. All of this stuff is when multiple values hit each other.
But
Yeah.
in this case,
Which is-
in the case that you're describing to me, you who inherited the estate did not make the vow.
Correct.
Your father
My
made
father
a
made
vow
the vow
that
on my
you,
behalf.
on your
Right.
behalf that you were supposed to fulfill, even though you
Right.
are an adult.
Right.
At the time.
Right. So
Did
it's
he have
different.
a right
Right.
to make such a vow incumbent upon someone else When may have he chosen?
It's a good question. I mean, I would be surprised if the rabbis were comfortable with someone making a vow for someone else. There's certainly gender politics that fit into that, where I know that shows up. Yeah, it's a good question.
Well, but on the other hand, the father in this case did not make a vow for the son. The question, though, is, does the son become obligated by the...
So all we know so far that we've read together is, in the case of an heir. We don't know anything else. Right? We can make assumptions.
Today, because people who made pledges to the shul for the centennial and they passed away, is their heir responsible for fulfilling their pledge?
That is the exact circumstance we're talking about, basically.
Yep.
Very profound.
All right, Rich, let's get some answers.
Okay, let's go.
One hopes. One hopes.
Well, we'll see.
Well, there will be some answers.
Satisfying or otherwise.
That is to say, does an heir transgress the prohibition against delaying a vow taken by his father? The Gemara explains the two sides of the question. Is it that the merciful one states in the Torah, when you shall vow a vow to the Lord your God, you shall not delay paying it.
Right, because that's the verse that is the basis of this mitzvah we're talking about. You shall not delay, right?
So he should have paid it off before he died.
Potentially. Keep going.
And this one, the heir, did not make a vow.
Right, so that's the first side, which is someone made a vow, and we have a mitzvah of not delaying, and the other person we're talking about did not make that vow. Okay, the other side.
Or perhaps the essence of the mitzvah is as it says, and there you shall come, and there you shall bring your burnt offerings and your sacrifices. And this one, the heir, is obligated to come and bring his father's offerings.
Nice, thank you. All right, so I think one side of this is really clear, which is someone made a vow, someone else is or is not obligated to it, right? There's the human part of that. Let's make sure we understand the second part of this section. What is the second, right, there's two sides of the question. What's the second side of this question? One is the person, and the second is?
The thing.
The offering itself, right? So the mitzvah is also the thing has to end up at the temple, right? So there's two ways to look at it. One is the obligation part on the person, and then the other side is the obligation on the object.
Yeah.
This thing is hekdesh. This thing is dedicated to the temple. It needs to end up there.
It doesn't matter who takes it.
That's the other half. I'm not saying that that's the answer. I'm saying those are the two halves that we're dealing with here.
Well, that's like settling the debt of the estate before you settle out the rest of it. You've got to pay the bills.
Potentially,
Very good point.
Well,
right?
I think maybe a slightly different view. On the one hand, right, it does say when you make a vow, right, which is specific to the person making the vow and not anyone else, versus when you shall come there. And since the son would still be going to that location, if you're going there anyhow, right, then you're obligated to bring it.
To drag the lamb along with you. Nice, right? So that's really, those are two halves of the same coin in some sense, right? All right, can I get another volunteer to read the next section here? Well, somebody gains the confidence. The Hebrew, the first two words is ta, shma. Ta comes from the word come, ata, and shma, which is here, right? So come in here, which introduces some sort of presumption, a solution, or an answer. And then ditane, tane comes from, it's the same root as the word Tanya or Ditanya or Tana, right? So we know it's going to be taught by what kind of rabbi?
An early rabbi.
An early rabbi, right? From that same period of time as a Tana or Ditanya or something like that. Here we have their name. It's Rabbi Chia. Okay, go for it.
So Tashma, Ditane Rabbi Chia, Me'amach, Purat Lioresh.
Nice. So before you read the English, I want to point out a really important word. It's the last word on the first line, which is parat. So this word has two meanings. One is it means detail. So in Talmudic hermeneutics, there's a difference between a general rule and a specific detail. Right? So if it says, you shall bring an offering, that's generalization, or you shall bring a lamb, is a detail. In this case, the word parat means to the exclusion of. It excludes the thing that comes right after it. So, all fruit is delicious, excluding bananas, right? As an example, right? That's just a personal feeling. Right, except for. Okay, now read the English.
Okay, so come in here and answer to this, as Rabbi Kia taught a baraita that says, the verse states, "For the Lord your God will surely require it from you." And that's actually the same verse. It's a different part of the same verse that we're quoting, which is interpreted to mean to the exclusion of an heir. This teaches that an heir does not transgress the prohibition against delaying a vow taken by his father. Now, where do they get that from?
Right. So why? So why might this word me'imach from you? Why would that exclude the heir?
It's singular.
I'm sorry?
It's singular.
It's singular.
It's referring to the person who made it.
Right. It will require from you as a single human. Right. From you in the singular, as opposed to me'imchem, from amongst you all. Right. So that might be one answer. Cindy, you don't seem particularly convinced by that.
No, I'm not, because once a person dies, his heir essentially stands in his shoes, right?
Perhaps.
So he's still an individual.
That's true. I think the reading here is you made the promise, you're responsible for it, right?
I get that. I'm not entirely comfortable with that because of the relationship with the heir.
Okay.
Because the heir stands in the
Right, but I think it's still open. We're just giving over what Rabbi Chia taught from the Baraisa. I don't. It's not decided by any means.
You may not like it in the end anyway, and that's okay.
But Cindy, I think your discomfort is exactly why there's this discourse, because the rabbis are trying to unpack this, and it's not, if it were clear, right? But I think actually the last line of Rabbi Steinsaltz's commentary actually, I think, makes a leap. Right? So far we've been talking not only about the question of delay, but are you obligated to bring the offering
At any time.
right? And so I think that the much of the discussion so far has been: is the heir obligated to fulfill the vow? We're not yet at the point of
Has he transgressed?
But
has he transgressed?
Does this Gemara take that up in that, or is it only about delay?
So it starts off the conversation about do not delay, but I think those things are intrinsically linked, right? Like you can't transgress, you shall not delay if you don't already have the obligation.
Right. But here, he's not giving over. You're not obligated. He's just saying.
Maybe do not delay doesn't apply to you. Right. I think that's where we're limited to so far. But I think the conversation about what kind of obligations do you have are inherent in this conversation.
Yeah, well,
It is kind of interesting because it
Gemara
keeps it focused on the do not delay.
Well, that is our subject, right?
Yeah.
but I mean, the notes indicate there's disagreement on the notes indicate there's disagreement on the question of is the heir obligated to fulfill the vow?
So let's find out. Does anyone else want to read in English the Gemara?
The Gemara asks, but this phrase "from you" is necessary to teach a different halakha, namely that one transgresses the prohibition against delaying, even for gleanings, forgotten sheaves, and produce of the corner of his field.
Obviously. I'm just kidding.
The Gemara answers that Achia
Wait,
derived.
let me just pause for 1 second. Let's just remember, the rabbis are uncomfortable with the idea of something coming to teach more than one thing per rabbi. So,
Per clause.
right, well, it depends on the rabbi, right? But here, for at least the Gemara, it seems like, as a person, if you will, that this me'imach actually is needed for some other purpose, right? So therefore it is invalid to use for this heir teaching. Keep
You
going.
have to pick one.
Right, you got to choose one. Exactly.
The Gemara answers, Rabbi Chia derived 2 halachot from this word.
Cheating.
He read into the verse, you, imah, which he expounded as coming to include gleanings, forgot sheaves, and produce of the corner of the field in the prohibition. And he read into the verse, from you, me'imah, with the extra letter mem coming to exclude an heir.
Nice.
So he's actually going both ways.
I love it. I love it.
But he's actually getting around this one because it's imah and the addition me, right?
So this just goes to show, right, that the rabbis are really paying attention to every letter, right? That every letter has an opportunity to teach us something different, which means it matters when we learn a little bit of grammar and learn the spelling and really pay attention, because you, right, imach, and from you, me'imach, don't mean the same thing. Right?
When you say different letter, you mean
the letter mem, yeah. Right? The letter mem adds an entire new meaning to Rabbi Chia. This would mean something entirely different without that mem. Everything hinges on the mem. It's pretty amazing.
But it's also an interesting kind of tangent, right? Because he says, okay, imach, from you. That means that this question of delay applies to a completely different set of obligations, right? This isn't a vow, right? These are obligations that you have to allow poor people to glean what your workers missed the first time around.
Right.
You know, the corners of the field. So
That's an easier thing to do because you don't have to travel anywhere. You're right there.
well, yeah, but it's still this question of delay, right? And then the question then becomes, well, let's say the father dies around harvest time, right? Is the son, right? The son's in mourning, but is obligated to, perhaps harvest the field so that the poor can glean. I mean, there's,
Is that the case?
I don't know.
I was spending the whole time just now trying to work out what it means when an heir inherits these obligations that are agricultural in nature, which, like, if the land is inherited from father to son, there's no question here. The son automatically has the same obligations because all Israelites who own farms are obligated. I get it's a tangent. So if you don't want to deal with it, don't worry about it.
So I think it's all wrapped up, right? Which is the primary mitzvah we're focused on is you shall not delay.
Right.
Right?
And you shall not delay of bringing an offering or first fruits.
Correct.
Whatever.
When you vow a
These
vow.
other three are like a new ring.
But
Correct.
he's extending it
But he's
beyond that.
exactly right, which is in the case. The original question is in the case of an heir for Rabbi Chia. All right. So wait, let's back this up. The question is asked in the case of an heir. In this circumstance we're talking about, you shall not delay. There are two sides to the coin. One is that this type of obligation does not extend to a person who themselves did not make the vow. Right? You make the vow, and it doesn't transfer because you made the vow doesn't mean I made the vow. Right? That's the first half. The second half is, well, there's this thing. It needs to end up at the temple. Maybe there's an obligation there. Is everybody with me?
Right.
Then the way they resolve this is Rabbi Chia says the word means excluding the heir from the obligation, pulling it out entirely. Right? The Torah says mi'imach, exclusion. The Gemara is unsatisfied with this for one reason or another, and we get this totally doubling effect, which is we get this word imach from the same verse that says, actually this subject of other types of agricultural obligations also somehow get plugged into you shall not delay in a totally different meaning. Right?
But the time frame changes. Suppose the vow is made, if one holiday passes, the person who made the vow passes away, the son is obligated to fulfill the vow, but does his time start over? So he has to go through the series of 3 more holidays in order for his not delay.
So yes, that is a very reasonable question on the assumption that the heir gets is obligated. I'm not sure that that's true. Rabbi Chia would say actually the heir is excluded
Well, the way I would understand this in this context, right?
Yeah.
This agricultural cycle, right? Is that, well, the father who owned the land would be obligated to do not delay, right? The father unfortunately passes away, and there may be some gap in the son kind of getting organized, coming up to speed about or who the workers are and what the schedule is. And, you know, from that standpoint, the exclusion would be to say, if through the period of mourning and through this transition, the son doesn't get it done on time, he's not liable for it.
So,
But he's still obligated.
Maybe he's still obligated to bring the thing
Right.
still has to
That's
get
the second half of that coin.
But the delaying part is what he's excluded.
But this isn't the getting there. This is the fields where people are going to come to.
Well, it's
the
a
field.
both, right? It's both things, right? It's the fields and
Right.
to exclude the heir from the you shall not delay. The obligation may still be there, right? So I think your point is the 2 points are together,
Right.
which is that obligation might actually still be there, but not you shall not
But there
delay.
are two obligations we're talking about. I mean,
Correct.
the issue is there are two obligations.
Correct.
And one of them may not apply to the heir, but the other one still does apply.
Right. Is everybody on the same page? Is that a yes? No? We can review one more time. Everybody feel like they get it? Okay.
Well, this
So-
also helps
please.
resolve any possible ambiguity, because if Gilmore had not asked this question, then one might go on and say, oh, well, maybe that applies to the produce in the field, and now we're saying, no, it's not. Right? With you, yes, but not the with you. So they're making very clear that that this is not about something else.
Right. We've now clarified the two mitzvahs that are bounded in this word. Absolutely. Okay. So this next section, with the little thing on the second to last paragraph, I think it's really valuable. There is a desire, I think, for us to read these texts in a kind of gender-neutral way, and I'm particularly a proponent of it. However, we don't want to shy away from that stuff either, understanding it as it is written. And so here we're going to talk about women and gender and the various obligations, and so I want to name it in advance. We're not going to shy away from it, even if, and again, I'm not saying whether or not the content is fine or not, but I want to name that we're not going to pretend it isn't there either. Okay. Can I get a volunteer to read another Rabbi Zera question? Go for it.
Rabbi Zera asks another question on this topic. In the case of a woman who made a vow, what is the halakha with regard to the prohibition, you shall not?
All right, let's pause right there. So the same question as we started off with.
Right.
What are the factors we might need to consider?
Okay.
Before we read. Before we read. Because this is about learning, thinking like the Gemara. So what are the factors we might need to consider?
How are women treated legally in society?
Right, so what responsibilities do, at least at this time, do women have that are different than men? For sure that's part of it.
And what kinds of vows can women make or not?
Right?
You
And
know,
all the more...
So is a vow that she would make that would be the exact same one that a man would make, is it actually even a vow for her?
For sure.
Where does she have to do it with her husband actually delivering the goods?
You know,
Right.
Which I think
how does
might
that
have
actually
been,
work?
which I think might have been the case.
Right, so I don't want to get too far into that because I don't know enough exactly because I don't want to say something that... Right, so the question is, one is, how incumbent is this vow in the first place? But let's make the assumption from the moment that it is.
All right, so she's allowed to own the property, be it the land that's producing or the animals or whatever. She's allowed to own it to promise it. Because if she doesn't own it, we don't know what's to do
Right, we don't know that,
We
but
don't know any of this
let's
yet.
make the assumption for the time being that this person is able to make the vow. Otherwise, this question doesn't make a lot of sense.
Well, it could be land that her husband had with no male children, so it might go to her, a female.
Right, so let's assume for the moment she has the authority to make the vow. Let's assume it for the time being. Are there any other factors we might need to consider? Well, I'm not discounting all those other questions. Those are really good ones. But if she can't make the vow, then the question makes no sense, right?
So, but the issue with women is this whole problem of time, whether time-bound mitzvot.
So we'll spool that out for us a little bit. So what is, explain that.
So the idea that women are not obligated to observe many of the time-bound mitzvot because they might not be able to. I mean, because biologically or because of other responsibilities.
One reason or another, right? So in some cases, depending on who you ask, the Gemara will certainly say that there are certain time-bound or time-enacted mitzvot in which women are exempted from the obligation, right? Because
not prohibited.
Right, not prohibited, exempted from the time.
For us
Right.
later.
Exactly.
But exempted from the obligation of which pulls right into do not delay, because what does do not delay mean if you're not under an obligation to observe things that are time bound?
Exactly right. Time is the factor when it comes to you shall not delay, and women, according to the Gemara, have some sort of mixed, complicated relationship with time-bound mitzvot. So it's not. So that's certainly, I think, the big factor here, assuming all of the vows and owning and things like that. Yeah.
We should also just remember that no one is really obligated to make these vows. I mean, you're bringing these on yourself.
That's
so
a very important.
The woman is somebody who really is stepping up to the plate,
right?
Beyond all expectations.
Right, all the more so, right? This is an optional vow. The rules might be different when we are obligating ourselves to something. All right, yeah.
Good. So, question of timing. So, when was it decided, relative to the time this was written, that women would or would not have different responsibilities for time bound or not? What is the timing of all
Yeah, so I would say the modern era is the time where we see that women are equally obligated to time-bound mitzvot. So the last number of decades, right? But I'm saying the last number of decades would be the halachic chiyuv obligation to these mitzvot. Until that point, I'll speak like the Reform movement treated women as equal to men much earlier, but the sense of obligation was different. So it's a different paradigm there. So I would say for most of Jewish history, women were exempted from these mitzvah.
When was that decided?
Separate number, a handful.
There's a few. That's what.
Setting aside Allah.
Time bound.
Right, specifically time bound. Specifically time bound.
About candles.
So when were women absolved from time bound? When did that take place?
From the beginning.
I would say it shows up in the Mishnah.
In other words, actually the same time, approximately the same time as all these discussions.
Right. So from the outset of the rabbinic process, let's say. But I will point out that the fact that women, just a total tangent, the fact that women, it's a women's, giant air quotes, mitzvah for candle lighting, and also exclusion from time-bound mitzvah makes no sense at all. It's a total conflict. That's a paradox as far as I'm concerned. But I'm not sure that makes so much sense. But let's not go down that rabbit hole because we'll stop learning Gemara at that point.
We'll never get through.
Yeah, exactly.
Ever.
So the question is, so here we're talking about the case of a woman who. The question is, what is the halacha? Just like we talked about with the heir, what is the halacha of a female person who, in regards to you shall not delay? Who is reading? Cindy, go for it.
The Gemara explains, do we say that she is not obligated to clear the temple of the pilgrimage, as this obligation is a positive time-bound mitzvah, which women are exempt, also does not transgress if she is late in bringing her offering?
Right, so here's an important piece, right? We ask, right, perhaps she doesn't have this obligation, right? And therefore, she may not have the second obligation.
Right.
Keep going.
Right.
Keep going.
Or, perhaps, since she is obligated in the mitzvah of rejoicing on a festival, she should also be obligated in some of the other mitzvot connected to the temple.
Got it. So she does have some sort of obligation for these festivals. She's not excluded from all of the obligations, right?
Right. So what other mitzvot is she obligated to, they ask?
Well, so here, right, we have rejoicing is certainly one, right? She's obligated to rejoicing on the festival, even if she doesn't have to show up at the temple. Why does the showing up at the temple part matter? Right, if you're bringing an offering, you have to be able to show up to, right?
Well, it's actually that you need to show up on a particular day at a particular time, right?
Because that's when the
Well,
sacrifices are
because the
happening.
morning sacrifice has to be offered in the morning, right? I think there's an analog, right? So again, traditionally, right, women are not obligated to be at morning minyan, which takes place at a particular time. However, women are still obligated to pray, right? The idea being,
You get to them after the
well, right. I mean,
breakfast.
when your kids give you a break, you take a few minutes to daven shachar. So, so again, I think that this tension between, on the one hand, the obligation at a particular time versus the obligation not at a particular time still, plays out in a lot of other ways.
Right.
Actually, just a little side piece on that. If you ride the buses in Israel, you often see women davening on the bus, right? Not so much men. I can't recall that I've ever seen men davening on the bus, but women all the time.
They're reading Tehillim because if they stop reading Tehillim, the bus will spontaneously run into a tree. I've been on
That's a commentary about Israeli bus drivers.
I've been on planes to Israel where women were like reading Tehillim, and I know from having read about it, they really do believe that like the force of their tefillah keeps Hashem Yisborach's wings underneath the plane, because otherwise the forces of gravity.
Well, because the plane wouldn't crash with people carrying out of
It will make me smack you.
All right, so I think it's really important that we're very clear about which angle we're looking at this, which is we're not actually talking about the obligation itself necessarily. We're still focused on you shall not delay. That's got to be in the back of our head here the whole time. Have a good day.
Have a good day.
So on one side there is a time frame here, right, and therefore she may not be obligated. And the other side is she does have obligations for this festival, so maybe she is obligated, right? Because we're not talking about any kind of thing, we're talking about a vow. Okay, another volunteer to read. We're on Abaye, the last paragraph of the page.
Abaye said to him, derive this from the fact that she is also obligated in the mitzvah of rejoicing on a festival.
All right, so what does Abaye seem to say? Is she or is she not? She is, according to Abaye so far. Right? She's obligated in rejoicing, therefore she is, do not delay is incumbent upon her. Keep going.
The Gemara asks, did Abaye actually say this, that a woman is obligated to rejoice at a festival?
Maybe he didn't say that. Didn't he? This is where we're going to see a contradiction. Keep going.
But didn't Abaye say, as for a woman, her husband must make her joyful for a festival?
Wait a minute.
Keep going. One more sentence.
Okay. This means that the obligation falls not on the woman, but upon her husband.
So this is a really interesting, funny dynamic, right? Which is sort of the dynamic of, at least in the Gemara, right? Perhaps women being in a receiving role here, as opposed to actually having the obligation for themselves. Which I'll say just for myself, I'm uncomfortable with. I much prefer the obligation part, just as a human being, not as the Gemara itself, right? The Gemara does its own thing.
And it's also a machloket about what this Rabbi Abaye actually said.
Right. It seems to be a contradiction
Someone
there,
heard
right?
him, and then someone else heard him some other time.
Yeah.
If a woman wants to get her husband, she can make a pledge, and her husband would have to fulfill it.
And she's gone for it. She's gone for
It's dangerous territory.
Yeah, Rich.
Gets a break.
Yeah, Rich.
So I'm not totally comfortable with. They seem to be getting to exempting women here,
Yeah.
and they bring in make her joyful part of it. I'm not. It seems convoluted to me a little bit that they're trying to get to this solution by bringing in, well, we're going to bring joy to our spouse.
Joy to the spouse by leaving the house to go daven.
Right.
So
That's true. No, but it says here she's absolved. She's absolved, Omar. So it says not he's leaving the house, and it falls upon her to do whatever needs to be done.
So I think there's a really important question here that that I think is underlying your question or your statement, which is, does the Gemara have a thrust of what it wants to happen? right? Does the Gemara want women here to be exempted or not? I don't think it's clear, by the way.
Okay.
But there's a reasonable question to be asked there, which is the Gemara doing everything it can to exempt women from this obligation or not? Right? I'm not sure that it is doing that, but it is a reasonable question to ask, right? Because it seems like on both hands it's trying to obligate and exempt women at the same time.
So I don't get it.
Right.
I don't read this as being in this situation that the Gemara is trying to push a particular view.
I agree.
I think the Gemara is taking the position of this really needs clarification. And especially because we've got two different memories of what this one rabbi said about it. And if we're taking his word for it, which word are we taking?
Right. But I think there are certainly times in the Talmud where the Talmud wants something to happen.
But I'm not sure in this case.
Right. I agree with you. I wholeheartedly agree with you. All right. Who's reading? All right. Finish this off here.
The Gemara answers, Rabbi stated his opinion in accordance with the statement of Rabbi Zera. Rabbi Zera holds that women are bound by a positive mitzvah to rejoice on a festival. Since, according to Rabbi Zera's opinion, they are obligated to the mitzvah of rejoicing on a festival, they are also subject to the prohibition, you shall not delay.
Okay, so Steinsaltz kind of clarifies it for us. At least Abaye is reading it with Rabbi Zera, who seems to be our guy here, at least in this conversation, who obligates women. Right? That obligation might be starting from a different place, not because it's time bound, because of rejoicing, but that obligation still rests because there is a relationship to this festival.
That's what you said
Right?
earlier.
This is the beginning of girls' night out. They took the obligation without delay to the temple, and the women can do whatever.
I like it.
I like that too. Oh, I like that one. That's easy. There's no loopholes
Like a week
there.
away from home. You gotta go on a trip.
Well, yeah.
It's okay, honey, you can go do it for me.
You go do that obligation. We won't delay. We're doing our own thing here.
You take care of the kids.
And then they all go to camp. They go out to the fields to work.
With our last little bit, I want to. There's a really nice breaking point, so I want to do a little bit more. So we're at the top of page 273, the very end of 6b. Woohoo! Very excited to get onto a new page. So we've sort of resolved these two issues, right? We had two issues about who's obligated. First, is it an heir? And second, what is the status of women in this case? Right? Both are sort of resolved. Maybe not for every case, but at least saying, in some way, shape, or form, they may or may not be obligated to you shall not delay. Right? Okay. So we're going to shift gears here. Let's see if there's any important words. No, I think we're okay. A dilemma was raised before the sages. Right? So we have some sort of, we already know we're getting into a disagreement. Right? We're a word in, a dilemma. In the case of a firstborn animal, from when does one begin to count a year with regard to their prohibition against delaying? So let's stop for a second. There is a mitzvah of firstborn animals. Are basically, I'm sorry, right, exactly, are obligated to be offered to the temple. Okay? Now, this do not delay is not a vow. Right? We're not in the vow territory anymore. Right? Okay.
An obligation.
We have an obligation. So the question...
But it's not the three festivals, the time frame is specified differently.
Right. We're in the you shall not delay, but in a totally different context. Everybody with me so far?
No, because the animals are seasonally. It's a seasonal thing, too.
Right. So for when does one begin to count a year? Abaye said, one counts from the time it is born. Rav Acha Bar Yaakov said, one counts from the time it is fit for appeasement. That is to say, from the 8th day when it is fit to be brought as an offering, as explicitly stated in the Torah, and then this verse from Leviticus. So we have two options. Are you looking at the verse? Nice. So we have two options. One is the animal is born, clock starts. But we learn in Leviticus, as we'll learn in a second, the animal is actually not subject to offering until day 8, right? And so then we have this dynamic, right? When do we count a year? Does anyone? Let's take votes. Who says the beginning of the year and who says 8 days? So beginning of the year. Anybody? Okay.
Not year. What?
The beginning. Sorry, the day it's
it was
born.
born.
I'm sorry.
Right.
Sorry, that's what I meant. Well, the question, there was always the beginning of the year,
We know what you
right?
mean.
Sorry, you're right. First,
So we're so used to
you're right.
talking
Sorry,
about
sorry,
years.
sorry. You're right.
Moment it's born,
So
okay.
the moment it's born. Anybody?
I vote for that.
Cindy? No, not Rich. And then the other one. 8 days. All right. Seems like.
I would vote for
Seems like what?
Some people didn't vote.
That's
That's
okay.
good.
Abstention. Abstention. That's okay.
I vote for birth.
Birth. All right. So you get that into the
Torah says
table.
the other way. I vote
Got
for birth.
it. Got it. All right. Let's read the verse.
Oh wait, I'm a chapter off, I'm sorry.
That's okay.
I'll have it here in a second.
I've got it.
27.
Also, we're into the bizarre esoteric questions of time again, because the wiggle, like if you're on the 357th day in which you can bring something as an offering, you're already a knucklehead. You're like, you're moving.
You've already
into-
waited.
right?
Yeah. You've already waited to the last possible
What's
second.
that say, 22, 27?
22. So you have it?
Yeah.
Go for it.
When a bull or a sheep or a goat is born, then it shall be 7 days with its mother, and from the 8th day on it shall be accepted for an offering made by fire to the Lord.
Okay. So that doesn't necessarily resolve our answer, but
Right,
that's
the
our verse.
opening.
That's
when,
it.
when you can begin to
Right.
Correct.
offer.
Correct. That's how we get the 8th day
Someone
to start
starts
with,
to the end there.
potentially. Right. Right.
But then,
That's not right.
but you could also say that if you count from the day that it's born, then that 8th day is the first possible day when you could fulfill your obligation.
100%.
You already have to delay to a certain extent before you can.
So I don't think the verse gives us an answer, but that's the basis of our mitzvah here, right? Of the 8th day. All right, let's keep going. The Gemara comments. The two sages do not disagree. This one, Rav Acha Bar Yaakov, who said that one counts from the time that the animal is fit for appeasement, is speaking about an unblemished firstborn, which must be brought to the altar for sacrifice. Now we're on the next one. That one, Abaye, who said that one counts from the time the animal is born, is speaking of a blemished animal. Since it was already fit to be slaughtered from the day of its birth, if one does not give it to a priest within a year of that day, he transgresses prohibition against delay. So here, we're talking about the thrust of the Talmud. The thrust of the Talmud is they don't want them to disagree, right? So the first case is the following. Yeah.
That doesn't make sense to me.
Yeah. Why?
Because I thought that it would be exactly the opposite. Hang on a second. Wait. Let me say what I think
Yeah.
and then tell me why it's not true. That you would have to bring an unblemished animal as your offering, not a blemished one.
From the outset, I think that is our assumption, right?
So here's like the
So-
reason.
Wait, let it finish,
So, if something is fit for appeasement, then, ready, unblemished.
Oh, so you want me to say it again? Right, so here's the case.
Okay.
We have on the left,
What is this really fit for appeasement mean?
right, that means that it is, you can offer.
Bring it as an
Right,
atonement.
so on one side we have Abaye. Abaye says born. That's the first time. And you have Rabbi Acha Bar Yaakov, who says 8 days. So let's take Rabbi Acha Bar Yaakov first. The Gemara says these are not actually two separate statements, they're referring to two separate cases. Case one, Rabbi Acha Bar Yaakov, who says 8 days. This is in the case of an unblemished animal,
Right,
firstborn.
Okay.
That I actually think that's sort of the simplest case, right?
Uh-huh.
The Gemara says actually Abaye is talking about a blemished animal,
Yeah.
right? Which can be slaughtered on the first day it's alive.
But can it be offered can it be offered as an offering to the temple?
No, and that's.
I don't think so. So there's there is a lot of rules around what,
and whatever, but it can't be.
and that's the question.
Right.
Okay.
All right.
Okay. That's
So that's why it's
that was the
Yeah.
link.
Cindy.
All right, but if the promise that you make is the next offspring of this particular
But this
cow-
isn't a vow though.
Ah.
This is firstborn. This is the obligation to firstborn animals.
Obligation of firstborn animals.
Yeah.
Okay, all right, so
No,
that's different.
right. So vow would be totally different.
Okay, gotcha.
right? So there is this injunction against bringing animals that have some sort of blemish to the temple. And so we sort of have this dilemma, right? Which I know when I read it, it was like, wait a second, blemished animals are not allowed to be sacrificed.
Right. I mean, that's where...
Right, but it doesn't say sacrificed.
No, that's right. It says slaughtered.
Right, which is, again, Rabbi Steinsaltz and not the Gemara.
Correct.
So we're going to read this last section here. This is the last paragraph we do today. The Gemara asks, which is the question we were asking, can an animal with a blemish really be eaten immediately on the day it is born? Isn't there a requirement to wait 8 days before slaughtering it in order to ascertain that the animal is viable and not born prematurely?
That's interesting.
Right? I'm not sure that I would have gone with the premature birth yet either, but there we are. So the question, right, is there's some sort of requirement to wait 8 days. The question is why? And if we read the verse, it talks about the first 7 days it stays with its mother. I think the presumption the Gemara has, or at least Rabbi Steinsaltz has, is those first 8 days are about viability.
Right.
Right? The Gemara answers. Right, so the question is, can an animal with a blemish really be eaten immediately? The Gemara answers. This is referring to a case where one is certain of when the animal was conceived and that its months of gestation have been completed so that it may be presumed to be viable. Which is, I know this animal is going to be okay, even with the blemish.
Right. So in other words, it's fit to be eaten, which also then kind of tells us something about what the mores of the time might have been, that if something is premature or is didn't go its full length, that it's kind of treif. I mean, in other words, you can't eat it.
Well, so I think...
I mean, there's something...
Yeah, so I think the question is about viability,
like
right? So if it is born prematurely, I think it becomes a question. Is this viable? And so then you wait.
Right.
But that's where this solves it, which is saying, no, this animal is viable from day one. I know this. I've been paying attention. Of course, that's sort of bonkers in its own way.
Because, wait a second, I'm thinking about what the other rules possibly are. What would happen if you decided that you were going to eat this little thing 2 days after it was born? Okay. Then, okay. You're not supposed to eat. You can't eat something that was going to die on its own. I mean, it feels like that's
right.
What the question that is.
Right, so here, it resolves that, satisfyingly or not, by saying, we know.
Right.
We know it's viable.
Because the traifness would happen.
You're saying we do that because it's going to die otherwise.
On its own,
right, we can't eat it.
7 days, then you really can't eat it.
Right.
And so you don't want to take the chance of disobeying that rule by eating it prematurely.
Right. It's sort of strange in some sense, right? Because the mitzvah, I mean, a lot of it.
Sort of.
But because remember, the context of this is you shall not delay.
Right.
Which is how long do we have? So like sort of that year we're counting from birth or the 8 days. Depends on this context, but we still have a whole year. So it's sort of its viability almost sort of matters, sort of doesn't matter. But in that counting is why it's relevant.
They also move on from it really quickly, which either assumes that it's not interesting to them, or that they answer those questions somewhere else in the Talmud, and that's just not a conversation we're having right now.
Right. I think that both of those are reasonable answers. Right. So we're going to stop there. We are finally on 7a. Not that it's a race, because it's not. But good learning today, everyone, and we will pick up again on Monday.
At any point, slap you. We are done.